Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming along to this talk about risk. I'm very happy to have been asked by the university to talk to you about risk and risk management, and particularly in the context of real-world business issues. So my name is Brian Honan. I'm CEO of BH Consulting. We're a small independent consulting firm based in Dublin, Ireland. And one of the areas we do specialize in is on helping our clients manage cybersecurity risk to their businesses. So I'm going to talk through on this talk about their various aspects of risk management. I appreciate you already have had a detailed overview of the theory behind risk management, but I want to just try and maybe apply this to real business environments and talk you through what it is. So for the purpose of this talk, this is the definition I'm going to use of what risk is. So basically, we understand risk to be the likelihood of the occurrence of a vulnerability multiplied by the value of the information asset minus the percentage of risk mitigated by current controls, the uncertainty of current knowledge of the vulnerability. And that's a very, very big word. For what we're trying to do is put some context on threats, risks, and vulnerabilities that we see to the business and how we manage those. And one thing we need to be very cognizant of is that risk management in cybersecurity context is still very immature. Unlike many other areas of business like financial risk, operational risk, etc., we don't have a whole lot of data from an IT perspective, given that the industry is only decades old and cybersecurity in itself is probably only 2 or 3 decades old within that. So we still have a lot of uncertainty around this area, and it's still very much lots of data that we don't have. But what we try and do is try and put context on it and put some structure on it. But when it does come to risk and risk management, very often we're very bad at understanding risk. So as humans, we don't contextualize risk very, very well. We always look at the absolute negative stuff all the time, but risk can have a positive impact as well. So for example, I could put money on the outcome of a football game or a horse race. I have the risk of losing my money, but I also run the risk of getting my money back. From a business point of view, I could put invest money in my business to expand into a new market. I run the risk of losing money, damaging the business if that doesn't succeed. But I also run the risk of gaining money, increasing market share, and improving the business if that risk proves to be positive. And this slide kind of shows you that in a way in that we can be quite happy sitting above the surface, maybe not understanding what the risks are below. But I think also, as I said, we don't understand risks very, very well. So when it comes to our sharks, we're probably a lot more scared of sharks than we are of mosquitoes. But in actual fact, if you look at the real data, you can see, and this is from the Bill Gates Institute to show that in the past 100 years, there's been just over 1,000 deaths attributable to sharks. But whereas in 2016, there was 1.5 times that number of people killed due to mosquitoes. Yet we focus more on the rare risk, which is sharks, because it's bigger, it gets the news headlines more so than on the mosquito, which is seems to be much smaller. So sometimes we can be very bad at contextualizing risk and trying to figure out what it is that we really should be focusing on where we can have it. So what is risk, though, when we think about it? Well, risk is a definable event. It is something that can happen or will happen. But we also say there's a probability of occurrence. So the impact of that occurrence and the risk occurs when that problem happens. The loss expectancy is that the threat might exploit the vulnerability, so how much money or what impact that could have to the business if that risk was to happen. And as I said, risk can have a very positive or very negative impacts. Often in cybersecurity and information security risk, we always view risk as having a negative impact. Our problem is, though, as humans, we do respond to breaking news, and the headlines and the shark and the mosquito are a very good example of that. We respond to the biggest, latest threats, and they're the ones we should care about as opposed to the normal day-to-day stuff. And in cybersecurity, that is even multiplied further because the big cybersecurity news stories are the ones that get the headlines, gets the attention. It actually sometimes can be a benefit to us as security professionals because very often we're left trying to promote good cybersecurity within the business. People don't pay attention to us because it's this area of business they can't relate to directly. But then a breaking news story talking about a major cybersecurity attack or a major weakness in software will get the attention, and that gets us back to us. So we have this a double-edged sword when it comes to cybersecurity. The breaking news can help us promote cybersecurity and can help us achieve our goals, but it also means that we tend to focus on the rare elements that do make the news rather than the day-to-day stuff. And this is a very important thing to think about when it comes to security risk. It's the day-to-day stuff that's going to get us rather than the unusual stuff. I do like this diagram to show the difference between risk and what risk management is. So we take our little stick man there. He's trying to get across the water there. So there's a high probability his feet are going to get wet, but there's going to be low impact because it's shallow. So we do have risks in our business that have a high probability of happening, but if they do happen, it's not really going to derail the business too much. So we're not overly worried about it. There's also the chance that we do have a risk that would have a low probability. So the next one down is stepping over the narrow gap. There's a low probability of getting your foot wet, and even if you do, there is a low impact. So again, there are risks that we don't potentially worry about too much. There may be a low probability risk or high impact. So yeah, the gap is still there, but if you go into it, there is a bigger impact, but there's a low probability of that happening. Now, we may be a bit more cautious about those type of risks, but again, it shouldn't stop normal business. And then there is the big risk, the high probability. This is definitely most likely going to happen. And if it does happen, we're going to have a high impact. So the decision is, do we still continue on with this? Because, a risk isn't guaranteed to happen. That's something that's important to remember. A risk is never guaranteed to happen. You can increase or decrease the likelihood or the probability of it's going to happen, but it's not guaranteed it will happen. So do you proceed onwards with your business based on that prospect, or do you think alternatively? And that may be based on where your business is. If you're in a mature business in a highly regulated industry, so for example, you're a bank in a highly regulated industry, you're managing other people's money, or you're a government department handling sensitive data or data of citizens, you're going to maybe think twice about dealing with risks that have a high probability and a high impact. But if you're a startup company, a brand new software company, or a new company that's trying to gain market share, you're probably more willing to take these risks because, albeit they may have a high probability of happening and a high impact on your business, it may not cripple your business. You may not have the same regulatory impressions. It could hurt your business, but you're so young as a business, you can recover quite quickly. So it's important to take that into mind when you're doing risk assessment, is looking at the context of the business it's in and what the impact it can be. And this picture, I think, often helps me visualize that in my mind. We can also look at the risk relationship. When we talk about risk, we tend to forget about that there's other elements that we need to include on this. At the very top left-hand corner there, we have what's called the threat agent. So that's the person or the item that's going to give rise to a threat. So we have a hacker. They give rise to a threat of hacking into our systems because they're going to exploit a vulnerability, a weakness in our system, which may be a software bug. That leads to a risk. There is a risk a hacker could break into our systems due to a vulnerability. That is our risk, okay? Now that risk, if that materializes, could damage an asset. That could be, system could be taken down. It could be brand reputation. And this can cause an exposure to us. And that can be measured and countermeasured by a safeguard. this in turn directly affects the threat agent or the capability or ability of the threat agent to exploit the vulnerability and make the threat materialize. So it's a kind of a circle all the time, and we need to be very much aware of those different elements as to what we're trying to do when we're managing risk. Understanding what the threat is, the threat agents that can materialize that threat, and what the vulnerabilities are, and then what the impact those risks can have on the assets, what the exposure should be. So it's important to keep all those things in mind. And when we look at a risk, this is what I like to think about. We have to look at defining and creating what's called a well-formed risk statement. I've often reviewed cybersecurity risks for companies, and I have, in their risk table, they have one line called hackers or security breach or computer virus down as a risk. And that, to me, that's not a risk. That's a vulnerability or a threat. It's a risk statement says what will happen, to what the impact will be to the business if the threat materializes through a vulnerability. So what we need to look at is, what is the asset we're trying to protect? Is it information? Is it a system? Is it people? What is the threat? What are you afraid of happening? And that can determine what the impact will be to the business. And the vulnerabilities, how could that threat occur? Is it a weak password? Is it unlocked doors? Is it badly trained people? Is it a software bug? And then what mitigations? What's in place to reduce that risk? Like, yes, we may have a software bug on our database server, but that is protected by layers of different firewalls, intrusion prevention systems, log monitoring, etc. So the vulnerability is there, but it's mitigated. Or yes, we have an unlocked door, but we have right behind that unlocked door is an armed guard. There are mitigations. We need to think of those as well. And the mitigations give rise to the probability. How likely is the threat going to happen given those controls? And then that can give us a well-formed risk statement. There is a high risk that hackers will break into our systems through the software vulnerability, resulting in damage to our brand. So there you go. We've the asset identified as what is we're trying to protect. The threat is hackers breaking in through a software vulnerability, and that gives us a well-formed risk statement. And it's important to understand the difference between threat and vulnerabilities too, before we understand risks. So threat, it's an event, the occurrence of which could cause an undesired impact. And the main categories of threats are human, natural, and technological. And in human, we have the malicious attack. So it's a theft. Somebody breaks into your building, into your business, and steals a laptop or steals a computer. Or it's a hacker, or it's sabotage. Somebody internally in the company is disenfranchised, is disgruntled, and would deliberately delete databases or a system. Or it's fraud. Somebody in the accounts department or elsewhere is committing fraud. These are malicious threats that you need to worry about. Then there's the non-malicious, because we have to take these into account as well. There's people making a mistake. I defy any of you watching this to put your hand up if you have never sent an email to the wrong person. We've all done it. Typed in the name, starting off with Brian, think it's going to Brian Honan, but it might go to Brian Murphy instead, because the email autofills and we don't double check. So mistakes do happen. People lose things. People may misuse of information. They may leak information accidentally, or post information onto forums onto a website accidentally. Or there could be disobedience, which is people bypassing security policies because maybe they don't understand the reason for the security policy, or they just want to get their job done. So these can be the human threats. We obviously have the natural threats as well, such as the traditional fire, flooding, and earthquakes. Thankfully, based in Dublin, don't worry about earthquakes too much. Flooding can be as well, and I'll just give you an example of flooding. Just don't think about rivers or lakes overflowing. Flooding is a risk in many buildings if you've got pipes running through the building as well. I actually worked with one client whose data center was in the basement, and most data centers tend to be in the basement. So obviously, if there's a leak in the building, all the water goes down and into the basement. This particular client, though, unfortunately, had in the floor above it were the toilets. So yes, there was a leak in the toilets. So when the proverbial hit the fan, this was the there was a real version of that. So when that leak happened, it was not a pleasant data center to be in and trying to clean up afterwards. You can also have technical risks. So you can have blackouts, you can have hardware failures, you can have network failures. Your ISP could go down. And this has happened in many occasions where roadworks, for example, have cut into telecommunication cables by accident, or ISPs have failed. We often see as well now more and more people moving to the cloud, and we just saw one recently. This lecture's gone out on December 2020, and just a few weeks ago we had a major outage in Google. So any services using Google, particularly Google authentication, were offline for a while. We also had Amazon have failure in AWS, and any services and products sitting on top of Amazon were unavailable as well. So you can have technical threats as well. A vulnerability in itself does not cause harm. It's merely a condition or a set of conditions that could allow a threat to affect an asset. So it can be a weakness or a hole in your information security management system. And if a threat is not managed, it may allow a threat to materialize. So basically, we have a threat or a hole in our organization. I mentioned earlier on, it could be a software bug, it could be a weak passwords, badly configured systems, badly trained people, etc. And some of these can be, key personnel. So somebody go missing, out sick, an unstable power grid, unprotected cabling, including wireless networks, lack of security awareness, software bug, poor passwords, out-of-date antivirus software, or firewall, no firewall installed. How do we do risk mitigation? Well, I think it's key for you once you move into the business world is you need to understand security risk. Okay, you need to be able to contextualize and put security risk down properly as well-formed risk statements. Understand technology. Now, I'm not expecting everybody to be an expert in every piece of technology that we use or that you may be working with, but do understand technology and the limitations of technology as well in particular. Probably the most important one is understand the business so you can contextualize everything you're putting in place. And once you have all those three in place, you can then look at ways maybe to accept the risk. As I said earlier on, maybe you're a startup company, you may accept the risk because you're a young company. If that risk materializes, it's not going to have too much of an impact. Or if it does have an impact, you can just start again. Whereas if you're a mature company, you may not be able to accept that risk. You could defer or transfer the risk, so you could outsource the risk to somebody else. So many companies nowadays are moving their email into the cloud. So that's one way of transferring the risk. You no longer have the risk of an unmanaged or a badly managed server, email server being hacked because of technology. You have that outsourced to a third party who looks at it. Or you can mitigate the risk. You can put more technology in place. You can put firewalls, antivirus software, various different ways to mitigate the risk. You can train people, etc. So that there are much better ways there are many different ways you can mitigate the risk. So there are the three ways you can do it. You can accept the risk, you can defer or transfer it, or mitigate the risk. Personally, I prefer the last two, and I delete rather than accepting the risk, because you're kind of saying, look, this probably could happen, and we're continuing on to make a sale. So always look for ways to defer, transfer it, or to mitigate it. Always understand the business you're operating in. I remember talking to a colleague once, and I asked him about good examples of understanding the business when it comes to risk. And he told me the story about he was talking to a CISO of a brewery, and he asked the CISO, what did he think his primary role of his job was as the chief security officer of the brewery, expecting the answer to be along the lines of, oh, it's to protect the secret ingredients we have in our beer, or to ensure our industrial control systems stay online all the time so we're not hacked, or to make sure our payment systems aren't hacked. And the CISO turned around and said, my job is to sell beer. And he was kind of stunned and said, well, what do you mean it's your job to sell beer? Your job is the chief security officer. You're not in the sales department. And he goes, no, my job is to ensure that everything our business needs to sell beer and make more profit and to keep in business, I need to ensure that happens. Whether that means making sure salespeople are secure when they're on the road, when people in the office are secure, when operating, that our industrial control systems are secure, etc. My job is to make sure all those are running. I've identified all the necessary risks and I've managed and mitigate those risks as best I could to ensure that we can sell more beer. And the risk management process he would talk about would be, for example, assessing the risk, determine what the risks are, and then doing some decisions on what do we do to mitigate it? Do we transfer it or do we accept it? And if you do decide to mitigate it, well, what controls do you put in place? And then you measure how good or effective those controls are. And if they're good enough, great. When you come back to assessing them again, you keep them in place. If not, or the risk has increased or decreased, you adjust your controls accordingly, all in the process of trying to identify the context of the business. And risk management, risk analysis, as you could see from this slide, is step one. Risk management is the overall process. So the goal of risk management is to manage risk across business to an acceptable level. The cycle is, it's an overall program across all the 4 phases, so across all these 4 phases. The schedule is it's a continuous thing, and it's not really aligned with any particular issue. Risk analysis, on the other hand, whereas the identification of risks is you identify and prioritize the risks. It is the single phase of risk management program. It's step 1, as per the slide there. It's a scheduled activity. It can happen, ideally should happen maybe twice a year, and ideally aligned with your budgeting cycle so that you can make sure you have the right investment and money you need to have in place to apply the controls you need. There are several different risk methodologies out there. The main contenders would be Octava, the Operationally Critical Threat Assessment and Vulnerability Evaluation, which is developed by Carnegie Mellon and their Software Engineering Institute. It's available for download from there. There's also CRAM, the CCTA Risk Analysis Methodology, Risk Analysis Management Model from Insight Consulting, which is and then you've got the NIST, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, special publication 800, which talks about cybersecurity risk. You also have a standard ISO 27005, which is an ISO, an international standard on risk management as well. The European Agency for Network and Information Security has also produced a website where you can go and have a look at all the main methodologies. It provides an overview of these tools and what they have, both commercial and open source. And you can compare the tools against each other, so they can tell you where they're how strong they are against each other. And it's actually a very, very good resource. And there's quite a lot of good information on that website from a practical point of view about how to conduct risk assessment, especially around the cloud, etc. But in the main, in my experience, there are 2 types of risk analysis. There's quantitative and there's qualitative. Quantitative attempts to assign real numbers to the costs and safeguards and the amount of damage that can take place. And qualitative is much more, it's an analysis that judges organizations which is more on intuition and experience, and for want of a better phrase, it's kind of like guessing, but it's more an educated guess that you're trying to do. And I'll go through these 2 in a bit more detail. So quantitative risk analysis is where we try and assign a value to information assets, be they tangible or intangible. So a tangible asset would be a device like a computer or a building. Intangible will be reputation, source code, information. You try and estimate the potential loss per risk. You do a threat analysis, derive the overall loss of the potential per risk, choose safeguards and countermeasures for each risk, and determine the risk response, such as whether that's mitigation, avoidance, or acceptance. And what this can give you is a very good monetary-based approach to risk management, where you can go, look, here's the cost if we don't put controls in place, and here's the cost if we do. And it's a much more solid argument that you can give to management. The key things you need to understand is what the exposure factor is. So how much of the asset loss can be identified by threats, 0 to 100%. So somebody steals a laptop, well, then that laptop is gone, that's 100%. But the exposure rate might not be the same for other different assets in the business. What is the loss expectancy in one occurrence of that risk materializing? And that will be the asset value versus exposure. So, if you have a 10% exposure factor and an asset worth $1 million, well, then your single loss expectancy is $100,000. So if you've got 4 of those losses in a year, that's a $400,000 issue. And that's the analyzed rate of occurrence. You estimate how the frequency of threat will occur within a year, and is characterized on an annual basis. So a threat occurring once a year would be 1, or a threat occurring once every 10 years would be 0.1, and a threat occurring 50 times a year would be 50. So your analyzed loss expectancy then is your single loss expectancy multiplied by your annualized rate of occurrence. So my example there of the single loss expectancy of $100,000 happening once, if you have a 4 times in a year, that's an annual loss expectancy of 400,000. And then here's your formula for doing a safeguard benefit analysis. I actually have an example in the next couple of slides, so we can go through that and to give it more details. And here's the example. A company's database is worth €100,000 to the company. It's estimated that the loss expectancy to a security breach is 30% of that asset value. In the previous year, the company experienced 2 security breaches. The company is looking to invest €12,500 in a security countermeasure, which happens to be a firewall. And this is going to reduce the probability of a security breach to once every 2 years. So the asset value is the database, which is 100,000, and you can see the before and after columns there. The exposure factor is 30%, so that means our single loss expectancy is €30,000. Annualized rate of occurrence is 2, so our ALE is 60,000. After the safeguard goes in, the asset value stays the same, the exposure factor stays the same, so does the SLE. But our annual rate of occurrence has gone down to 0.5. So the annual loss expectancy is €15,000. So we're saying now, instead of expecting to lose €60,000 per year, we're now going to lose €15,000 per year. But we've put in, on top of that, we've put in a safeguard benefit of €12,500. So the total safeguard benefit per year is €32,500. And that's a very strong argument to go to management and say, give us €12,500, we're going to save you €32,500, or £12,500, £32,500. Sounds great. And here are the pros and cons. Pros are use probability concepts, and so you've got the likelihood that a risk will occur or not occur. The value of the information is expressed in a monetary value, which is supporting rationale. And the risk assessment, because it's based on money, is very much derived and expressed in management speak. The cons are purely quantitative risk analysis is not possible, because quantitative measures must be applied to qualitative elements. How do we value reputation? How do you value your database? It can be very difficult to do that. Can be less ambiguous, but using numbers can give appearance of specificity that does not exist. So while we try and use numbers, maybe it's not hugely scientific, and huge amounts of data must be gathered and managed, which in turn means a huge cost. Qualitative risk analysis is very much doesn't assign money or value to components and losses. It walks through different scenarios of risk possibilities, and you rank the series of threats for this based on sensitivity of the assets. So basically, as I said, it's a educated guesswork here, or that's probably too loose a phrase, but it's a less formalized approach. And very often we try and take in expert interviews, use brainstorming sessions, and use normal group techniques, or use analogies to try and figure out, well, what would the impact be on it. So What would be the likelihood of a meteor hitting our building? Is that high, medium, or low? Well, it's obviously low. Sorry, the impact will be high. The likelihood will be low. Excuse me. And you can use different matrices. You can have this way where things can be in a risk assessment chart. You got 4 areas there, and you can have risks fall into the different quadrants based on their impact and probability. And again, you work it through it. Sometimes you use a risk matrix, which can be a likelihood it's going to happen, it's almost certain, likely, possible, unlikely, and rare, and the consequences can be rated that way as well. And this can be converted into this chart. So if something is likely to happen, it's almost certain, and it's extreme, we've got a critical risk. If something is rare and it's going to happen and it's going to be extreme, it could be a medium risk. And so you can work away on this to try and give you an idea of where the risk can happen. The pros with this is, and they can't be underestimated, particularly in a business context, is that it's simple and readily understood and executed. And it does provide a general indication of significant areas of risk that should be addressed. In my experience, using qualitative versus quantitative, quantitative gives you nice numbers and can be a stronger help in you debating stuff with management to get budget, but quantitative takes a lot of time and money, where qualitative takes less time and money. And to be fair, you end up pretty much in the same ballpark as with quantitative. So you get the same results for a lot less effort. The cons are it's difficult to enforce in uniformity and consistency. Now, it does provide some order measurement, but it's very subjective. It's not very objective an approach. So it's subjective onto on the individual. So I might do a risk assessment just straight after we've had a security breach. I'm going to be very subjective on my assessment based on my experience or stuff that I'm reading in the media, whereas the quantitative will be less subjective. I mean, it's very hard to provide a cost-benefit analysis of this approach. And this chart gives you a nice overview of the quantitative versus qualitative, the pluses and the minuses of both approaches. So quantitative is independent and objective, where qualitative isn't. Quantitative can give you cost-benefit analysis, qualitative isn't. Quantitative is monetary based and qualitative isn't. Now, you might say that's a plus or not. For management, it can often be. The amount of work, cost, and time is much less in the quantitative. It's a big advantage in the qualitative because you don't have it as much. And lots of consulting firms, particularly the big consulting firms, prefer the quantitative approach because obviously there's more money to be made because it takes longer time. Much of information required is much more in quantitative, and it can put drains on an organization because you're now talking to financial people and everybody else trying to get their impact. But quantitative can be easily automated, qualitative not so. The value of information is understood under quantitative, not so under qualitative. And threat frequency and impact data required, maybe not so from qualitative. And this comes from the ISC squared analysis. There are quite a few frameworks out there. ISO 27001 and ISO 27005 are frameworks that I would recommend you use. I recommend you go look in the NIST cybersecurity framework, the SP 800. And if you're looking for technical security controls to help you manage your risk, the Center for Internet Security provide you with some very good critical security controls you can use. If you're looking specifically towards the cloud, again, I'd recommend the ANISA publications that they have. They're very easy to use and they are free. And there's also the Cloud Security Alliance, which has many publications up there on how to manage that as well. Here's some additional reading that you may find useful in understanding this a bit better. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and attention. Hopefully you found this to be of interest and a benefit. And thanks to the university for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. If you have any questions or need any particular follow-ups, please don't hesitate to contact me on any of the above. Thank you.